Joining us from New York is Norina Hertz. She is the author of The Debt Threat. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Steve, for having me on.
Why do you consider third world debt a problem?
Well, the world's poorest countries, sub-Saharan Africa, a region where 26 million people are HIV/AIDS infected, is having to pay out $30 million every single day on debt service. Just think how many doctors and teachers and medicines and school books that money could otherwise be used for.
What is your message to the U.S. and the other Western countries?
The message is very clear. We have to cancel the debts of the world's poorest countries when that means that a country cannot provide basic health care, shelter, sanitation, education to its people because it has to repay its debts. We have to have action on this now. There is a real state of emergency in the developing world, and it's an emergency that we can do something about.
There is a proposal that's been put forth by the U.S. government. It was presented to British Prime Minister Tony Blair last week at the G7 finance ministers meeting. Can you outline the details of what the Bush administration is and isn't suggesting to France and Germany and Great Britain?
Well, what's happened is the world's developed country leaders have acknowledged at long last that existing ways of debt relief just ain't working. And there are various competing proposals now on the table for what to do next. And really the issue kind of revolves around, as always, who's going to foot the bill for debt cancellation. The United Kingdom has a proposal whereby the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, will sell off some of its gold reserves to finance part of this debt cancellation. The United States has another proposal which doesn't agree that the gold should be sold off and instead says that the World Bank should play a bigger part in financing the debt cancellation itself. But at the moment, no one can agree on who will actually foot the bill. And whilst they can't agree, millions of people are actually dying as a consequence.
One of the points from your book, Norina Hertz, is that for the price of 4 stealth bombers, 155 million children can be sent to school for a year. Do you view this as an either-or when it comes to military spending by the U.S. and other Western nations?
Well, I mean, governments have limited resources and they have to decide how to allocate them. In terms of national security, we're really operating in this kind of old Cold War paradigm where we think of military expenditure as the best way to protect ourselves. But of course, in today's climate, that isn't so. And when you have a developing world that is incredibly poor, what we're seeing is that that's extremist organizations are gaining public support in these regions, because when the state doesn't have money to repay, to provide health or hospitals or schools, extremist organizations come in and they do so in their stead and are getting a lot of grassroots support as a result. So in Afghanistan you have terrorist training groups, training terrorists, extremist groups, but also digging wells and providing bakeries. So when we think about how best to protect ourselves, we have to look at development aid as a part of that package. And that's why it is worthwhile comparing military expenditure to development aid and seeing that really we've got the package very wrong.
We're talking about the third world debt with Norina Hertz, who's the author of a book on the subject. She is currently a visiting fellow at the University of Cambridge. She attended college there where she earned her doctorate. She's also a graduate of University College in London and earned her MBA from Wharton. She's written a number of books and is joining us from our studios at Pace University in Midtown Manhattan. Our phone lines are open. You can also email us, journal@cspan.org. Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, good morning.
Thank you for taking my call. I'm very curious as to who do you think is going to handle our debts? We're about $7 trillion in debt, and we have an $11 trillion trade imbalance. And I got a good feeling that President Bush wants to take that Social Security money and give it to the financial institutions because they're about ready to crash. I've been reading this in European news. I've been watching German and British television, and I think we're really in a lot worse shape than most Americans know. And I certainly sympathize with your position on helping these other countries, but I think the whole world financial situation is about ready to collapse.
Thank you. Ms. Hertz?
Well, I mean, obviously you have a terrible looming debt crisis of your own, you're absolutely right. And even if you look at consumer debt figures in this country, they're escalating at an alarming rate. But, you know, when people are borrowing money and getting into debt, at least they have VCRs to show for it, DVD players, houses, cars. In the world's poorest countries, the people there, they've got nothing to show for the debt, because actually what happened was, during the Cold War, the time when these countries really got into the debts that they're in today, we in the West were bankrolling the most tyrannical and corrupt dictators the world has ever seen. They stole the money. The people in the countries never benefited from it, and yet they today are being asked to foot the bill.
From the book on page 30, you write that Saddam Hussein was provided with loans amounting to around $100 billion, several times Iraq's GDP, during the 1980s by governments intent on serving their own geopolitical purposes. Half of this money came from Arab states led by Saudi Arabia in order to support Iraq's invasion of Iran. On top of this came $7 billion worth of credits from the Russians, $6 billion from the French, several $billion from the Germans and British, and at least $10 billion from the United States. Can you explain?
Well, I mean, you know, in order to further geopolitical interests, in order to have Iraq on the right side during that period, but also, more importantly in the Iraq case, in order to further corporate interests, the West and other countries bankrolled Saddam Hussein. So that, for example, there was a case of chemical weapons plant, Fallujah No. 2, just outside Baghdad, built with hundreds of millions of dollars worth of United Kingdom loans in this case. The money's lent, even though in the British Parliament questions were raised saying, why are we lending money which we know will be used for a chemical weapons plant? Why are we lending money that can be used so that Saddam can produce nerve agents? This is after the world already knew that he'd been gassing tens of thousands of Kurds. But the British Trade Minister at the time said, well, we have to do this in order to support our trade interests with Iraq. So really skewed lending. And then the Iraqi people were being asked to pay this bill, to pay for the knives that Saddam used to slaughter them.
Manchester, New Hampshire, for Norina Hertz. Good morning.
Good morning. I'd just like to challenge your guest's statement that not forgiving the debt is killing people. Basically, nothing has changed. The fact that they owe money has no effect on their daily lives. With the exception is, what you're saying is that if we forgive the debt, they can borrow more money, which they're not going to pay back later on. So that's what you're really saying. You want it forgiven so that they'll be able to borrow money in the future and, once again, misuse it. So, you know, to say that it's killing people is really fallacious.
Well, I really object to how you've laid this out, because Niger, the country with the highest infant mortality in the world, is currently paying out more on debt service than it is on health care. Cameroon, Sierra Leone, Mauritania, all paying out more on debt service than they are on education. The world's poorest countries, sub-Saharan Africa, paying out in debt service 85% of all the aid flows that are coming in. You've got to remember, this is a region where 40 million children will lose a parent to HIV/AIDS within 10 years. So to say that repaying the debts has no consequence is obviously absurd. But you do raise a point that is worth spending a little bit more time on, and this is the point, well, are these countries just going to kind of get into debt again? We need, at the same time as cancelling debt, to reach deep in our pockets and give more in the form of grants too. It's very clear. I mean, the world's richest countries all signed up to this thing, the Millennium Development Goals, which said that by 2015, the goal was to have the world's poorest countries see infant mortality halved, poverty halved, huge progress on kind of the number of kids who go to school. We're not going to reach these goals, and we all know we're not going to reach these goals unless the rich world gives more in the form of aid too. 0.7% of GDP is what each country is supposed to be giving in order to reach this 2015 goal. Britain isn't anywhere near that. Italy's not anywhere near that. The United States is only spending 0.14% of its GDP on aid at the moment. Unless the rich world gets with it, it's not only the poor world that's going to be destroyed, it threatens us all.
Colorado Springs, Colorado is our next caller. Good morning.
Good morning. I'd like to really agree that we need to fight AIDS where it's starting, and but the problem I have is the last time we really helped Africa, we gave lots of medications, and they ended up in Europe, and the governments of Africa were making profit off the medications that were supposed to go to the people. We need to make sure that there's some kind of accountability and to make sure the people are getting the medications that they are supposed to be getting.
Yeah, you are absolutely right. And that's why in my new book, The Debt Threat, I really address this question, because we have got to accept that in some developing countries, the interests of the poor, the needy, the sick and the marginalised are not put first by their leaders. And in order to deal with this problem, in order that debt relief and even aid does reach those who most need it, we have to create a mechanism whereby monies are protected and actually put aside for the purposes of poverty alleviation, healthcare, education and development. And we can use mechanisms similar to trust fund mechanisms in order to do that. And there is precedent for this in the developing world, in the area of conservation, where monies have been put aside for environmental purposes in trust funds and actually reach there. And Uganda has, although not as formalized a trust fund as I propose, put 97% of debt relief savings into a fund, and as a result we see primary school enrollment having doubled there over the past 3 years, and we also see real progress made by that government on their HIV/AIDS crisis. But you're absolutely right, we have to protect monies so that they reach those that need them and do not get wasted or stolen.
Our conversation is with Norina Hertz. She is joining us from Midtown Manhattan. She's the author of a book that was first published last fall in Great Britain. Here in this country, the title is The Debt Threat: How Debt is Destroying the Developing World and Threatening Us All, published by HarperCollins. Philadelphia is next. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you? First of all, I want to know whatever happened to the old saying, charity begins at home. And number one, that woman's sitting there because she's trying to sell a book, and I'm very much against all these foreigners coming over here and telling us what to do and how to do it. So I wish you'd return to England where you belong.
Thank you, caller.
Thank you for your hospitality. This is a fantastic country. I mean, it's a country that has values and principles which, you know, can provide an amazing steer to the rest of this world. And this country is actually incredibly generous when it comes to private charitable giving. Private individuals and private corporations give a lot of charity here. But in terms of foreign aid and the percentage of gross domestic product that is given to foreign aid, the United States really isn't pulling its weight in the way that it could, which is, you know, which really is sad, because this country can give so much and play such a fantastic role out there in the world, and yet this administration is not putting his money into these purposes. I mean, I don't want to romanticize Britain and I don't want to romanticize Europe. I mean, we're doing terrible things when it comes to development ourselves. The European Union is continuing to subsidize each and every cow to the tune of $2.50 a day, when over 1 billion people live on less than that. So it's a matter of all of us collectively doing something to create a better world, not only for our own sakes, but for future generations too.
Norina Hertz, every January and February, this network devotes a number of hours to the World Economic Forum that takes place in Davos, Switzerland. What is the background to that meeting? How often have people like yourselves and others met there, and what comes from those sessions?
Well, yeah, I've just come back from there myself a couple of weeks ago, and what it is, it's a gathering of the world's business leaders and political leaders and increasingly activists and people from pressure groups and non-governmental organizations getting together to really look at what are the key issues in the world today and what are we going to do collectively to address them. And I spoke on a few panels at the forum this year. And what was incredible this year, and I've been going for 4 years now, what was really different this year was that for the first time there were sessions on, for example, Africa or development that were absolutely packed, oversubscribed, people kind of queuing to get in to a session on Africa, but they were. It was amazing. I mean, a panel with Tony Blair, with Bill Clinton, with Bill Gates, Bono the rock star, Mbeki the president of South Africa, Obasanjo the president of Nigeria, Mkapa the president of Tanzania, managing to get thousands, literally over 2,000 of the world's top business leaders and politicians in a room to discuss Africa. Now, that isn't just because there's a moral imperative dealing with that region. It's not just because it's a travesty that 34,000 children are dying every day there because of poverty-related diseases, but it's also because people in the rich world are increasingly realizing that to allow the exclusion and marginalization of that area is to our own peril.
Los Angeles is our next caller. Good morning. Thanks for joining us.
Yes, thank you very much. Noreen, I'd like to talk to you about the potential of this country becoming a third world. I'm a longshoreman. Every contract up and down the West Coast is owned by a communistic country or an Oriental country. They control and own the ships, the cranes, the chassis, the containers, the cargo, and if they break the Longshoremen's Union, they'll have nothing but Korean labor in here. We have a border that's wide open. They have shown, the Republicans are trying to impress the public in regard to their security, and what they do is check us as longshoremen and not the people that are coming in from across the borders and or our foreigners. They have spent $54 million on homeland security, they claim. They bought a couple of x-ray machines, and the numbers that they continue to x-ray during the day is falling off because they're getting lax. This, I don't know where all the money's going. I don't know what the Republicans are doing with it. We work for a company called SSA. The president of that company is a heavyweight politician. He has locked up the stevedoring operation in Iraq without contract bidding. We're looking at, and the problem with the borders, if they want to control those borders, why don't they put a hiring hall on the Mexican side and charge them to come here to go to work?
Thank you,
Why
caller.
Why don't we work on making life so good for people in developing countries so that they don't even want to come here? I mean, why don't we reframe it so that we look at, why don't we make sure that people have opportunities where they live so that they don't need to come elsewhere? Why don't we make life acceptable for people elsewhere so that their kids will be able to go to school, so that their kids will get health care if they're sick, so that they don't need to travel and cross borders and come elsewhere and leave their families? That's how we should be thinking about these issues.
Norina Hertz, who's also the author of The Silent Takeover, as we get this next call from Fort Myers, Florida. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you? My question is, my proposal is, I agree with you. We should help third world countries, but I don't believe there's any correlation with money and extremists. There's always going to be extremists, and if we help people out, we have to hunt down the extremists first, or they're going to take over what's given to them.
It is obviously a nuanced argument, the one between poverty and terrorism, because we all know that many of the terrorists that we've heard of are not poor. They're middle class or even rich. And we also know, of course, it would be wrong to say that everyone poor goes and becomes a terrorist or an extremist, because of course they don't. But what we do see is that when a country is desperately poor and when a state isn't providing schools or hospitals to its people, extremist organizations are coming in and they're getting a lot of support. In Pakistan, for example, there are now 6,000 extremist religious schools there, where kids aren't taught how to read and write. I mean, they're taught how to fire a gun and hate the West. But the schools are there and people are sending their kids to those schools because the state isn't providing sufficient normal, secular education for its population. So there's a real danger that when the state cannot provide monies or isn't providing funds to its people or services, extremist organizations are. And that's part of the reason why it's in all of our interest to ensure that states are not using their pitiful resources on first servicing debts to the world's richest countries.
From the book, The Debt Threat, our guest says our political leaders will first have to be convinced that this is what their constituents want. Opinion has to be massively mobilized, but indifference and apathy to the developing world's plight are no longer viable options. You conclude by saying, discuss it, refine it, improve upon it, but don't ignore it. You can't afford to. Next call is Brooklyn, New York. Good morning.
Ms. Hertz, I agree with everything you said so far. You're wonderful. But I was wondering, the way you have to try to convince some of the people that are not on board yet is, you say you take the first, say the bottom 10 countries in the world that are really desperate. You relieve the debt, and then you have to figure out what to do to make these economies viable. If you can give us some examples or solutions to these problems, and people, the rich countries that are actually paying for this will say, okay, then, that makes sense because it's a practical solution and we're not just throwing money, constantly at a problem that's never going to be solved. For example, there's a Oxfam, for instance. They had a campaign with cotton farmers in, I believe it's Mali. I'm not sure exactly which country in Africa it was, but they're saying that America subsidizes their cotton farmers at such a high rate that people in these poor countries can't make a living. And the way to solve this would be maybe fair trade would be one example of solving the problem. Do you have any other suggestions or solutions to this?
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think really if we think about a holy trinity for dealing with problems of development, it's really debt relief, aid and trade, because you're absolutely right. The world's poorest countries, what can they sell to us? They can sell agricultural products, food products, and also textiles. Yet these textiles and agricultural products are industries which we in the developed world are subsidizing. So we're making it impossible for the world's poorest countries to sell their products to us. They just can't. They can't meet our subsidies. They just can't do it. And in fact, they're losing $2 billion every single day, it's estimated, in lost sales. So if we're really serious about giving the third world a chance to earn its way out of misery, then we have to do something on the trade subsidy front. But even if countries don't have subsidies on trade, even if we deal with that, if a country is still having to pay out in debt relief 85% of its budget, there won't be money for roads, there won't be money for education, there won't be money for healthcare. So countries again will not be able to trade their way out of the problem. So we really have to look at it in these three ways: debt relief, aid and trade. And we can get fantastic results. I mean, we see in countries where debt relief has been given, or in countries where aid has increased, as long as the monies are actually used for sensible purposes, and that has to be a condition of all this, that we do protect the monies so that they are used in sensible ways. We see already results like the Ugandan case, where primary school enrollment has doubled over the past few years, where they've made real progress on their HIV/AIDS dealing with. So we see that it can work. It's a matter of creating the political will so that we actually take action on this front.
But isn't it really a double expenditure, if you want to call it that, for the U.S. and other Western countries? You wipe away the aid, and then you also provide an infusion of cash, millions or maybe billions of dollars for roads and bridges and infrastructure.
This isn't going to come for free. This isn't, there is going to be a cost attached to ensuring that the developing world does develop. But, $170 billion is what it would cost, for example, to cancel all the debts of sub-Saharan Africa. That's less than the US cost of military operations in Iraq so far. So it's not a matter of available resources, it's a matter of what we choose to do with them. But that investment in the developing world today is an investment in the children in those countries, in the grandchildren of the children in those countries. It's an investment in our environment, because of course when a country's poor, the first thing it does is it cuts down its rainforests, it allows dirty industries to pollute the environment, it doesn't prioritize the environment. We're buying a safer world for all of us, so although it will cost today, in terms of the future gains, wow, they're priceless.
Next call, Honolulu, Hawaii. Good morning. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Yes, I'm calling from, like I said, you said from Honolulu, but basically I want to say I'm originally from Peru in South America, and I just have a couple questions here for you guys. And I was wondering how forgiving the corrupt governments' debts in third world countries will benefit their people. Like I said, I'm from Peru, and year after year, I've seen the country just go down, and is basically due to bad management. And also, I wonder how forgiving debts to African countries where they have this AIDS epidemic going on will help the people there when. One of the major problems there is it's a cultural issue.
Thank you, caller.
Well, I think we've just got to be very clear on this, that most of the monies borrowed by developing countries were not actually borrowed by their current governments, but by former governments, many of whom were terribly corrupt. And we in the West lent to them. We lent to Suharto in Indonesia. We lent to Marcos in the Philippines. We lent to Abacha in Nigeria. We lent to Mobutu in Zaire. I mean, we lent to Saddam Hussein. I mean, we lent to some of the worst regimes in the world. In fact, congressional hearings currently taking place in the United States have revealed that up to a third of monies lent by the World Bank over the past 6 decades was stolen. Not that surprising when you think those were the regimes they were lending to. So I'm saying we've got to cancel debts that were lent to formerly dictatorial, corrupt regimes. The people in those countries, they never elected those dictators. They didn't benefit from the monies, and they sure shouldn't have to pay the price. Today, they've already paid in many other ways for having these terrible regimes. But you are right, and I stress that there should be one condition for debt relief, and that is that the monies are protected so that they do reach those that need them, because you're right, we know that isn't always so. But there are mechanisms that enable us to do it, trust fund mechanisms, which enable us to protect monies so that they actually reach those that need them. That's how we have to be thinking about development today. We have to think it's a matter of justice that the monies be cancelled, but also a matter of justice that the monies do reach those that need them, and put in place the mechanisms to ensure that that's the case. And in Europe, based on my proposals and my ideas, we now have working groups within various governments looking at how to make these trust funds operational.
The book is called The Debt Threat: How the Debt is Destroying the Developing World and Threatening Us All. The author is Norina Hertz, who's a fellow at the University of Cambridge in London and joins us from Midtown Manhattan as she continues her book tour around the country. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me on.
President Bush is at the Justice Department for the swearing-in of the 80th Attorney General, Alberto Gonzales. He was formally voted in by the Senate a week and a half ago and has been on the job, but this is a ceremonial ceremony that the President is attending. He's attending the ceremonies for all of his new cabinet appointees. Later in the day, the President will be meeting with the head of the International Red Cross to talk about the issue of the detainees in Guantanamo and elsewhere. The House is in a pro forma session. The Senate will begin debate today on the nomination of Michael Chertoff. A vote is expected tomorrow to be the next Secretary of Homeland Security. Right now in the
United Kingdom has a proposal whereby the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, will sell off some of its gold reserves to finance part of this debt cancellation. The United States has another proposal which doesn't agree that the gold should be sold off and instead says that the World Bank should play a bigger part in financing the debt cancellation itself. But at the moment, no one can agree on who will actually foot the bill. And whilst they can't agree, millions of people are actually dying as a consequence.
One of the points from your book, Norina Hertz, is that for the price of 4 stealth bombers, 155 million children can be sent to school for a year. Do you view this as an either-or when it comes to military spending by the U.S. and other Western nations?
Well, I mean, governments have limited resources and they have to decide how to allocate education to its people because it has to repay its debts. We have to have action on this now. There is a real state of emergency in the developing world, and it's an emergency that we can do something about.
There is a proposal that's been put forth by the U.S. government. It was presented to British Prime Minister Tony Blair last week at the G7 finance ministers meeting. Can you outline the details of what the Bush administration is and isn't suggesting to France and Germany and Great Britain?
Well, what's happened is the world's developed country leaders have acknowledged at long last that existing ways of debt relief just ain't working. And there are various competing proposals now on the table for what to do next. And really the issue kind of revolves around, as always, who's going to foot the bill for debt cancellation.
Joining us from New York is Norina Hertz. She is the author of The Debt Threat. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Steve, for having me on.
Why do you consider third world debt a problem?
Well, the world's poorest countries, sub-Saharan Africa, a region where 26 million people are HIV/AIDS infected, is having to pay out $30 million every single day on debt service. Just think how many doctors and teachers and medicines and school books that money could otherwise be used for.
What is your message to the U.S. and the other Western countries?
The message is very clear. We have to cancel the debts of the world's poorest countries when that means that a country cannot provide basic health care, shelter, sanitation, part of that package. And that's why it is worthwhile comparing military expenditure to development aid and seeing that really we've got the package very wrong.
We're talking about the third world debt with Norina Hertz, who's the author of a book on the subject. She is currently a visiting fellow at the University of Cambridge. She attended college there where she earned her doctorate. She's also a graduate of University College in London and earned her MBA from Wharton. She's written a number of books and is joining us from our studios at Pace University in Midtown Manhattan. Our phone lines are open. You can also email us, journal@cspan.org. Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, good morning.
Thank you for taking my call. I'm very curious as to who do you think is going to handle our debts? We're about $7 trillion in debt, and we have an $11 trillion trade imbalance. And I got a good feeling that President Bush wants to take that Social Security money and give it to the financial institutions because they're about ready to crash. I've been reading this.
Hate them. In terms of national security, we're really operating in this kind of old Cold War paradigm where we think of military expenditure as the best way to protect ourselves. But of course, in today's climate, that isn't so. And when you have a developing world that is incredibly poor, what we're seeing is that that's extremist organizations are gaining public support in these regions because when the state doesn't have money to repay, to provide health or hospitals or schools, extremist organizations come in and they do so in their stead and are getting a lot of grassroots support as a result. So in Afghanistan you have terrorist training groups, training terrorist extremist groups, but also digging wells and providing bakeries. So when we think about how best to protect ourselves, we have to look at development aid as a part